Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this webinar on the growing threat of urban flooding, a national challenge, the report we put out just earlier this morning. Before I turn things over to Dr. Jerry Galloway from the University of Maryland and Dr. Sam Brody from Texas A&M University, I just wanted to let everybody know that we are recording this webinar and it will be made available after this. So if you have to drop out earlier or you want to share it with somebody, we will have this file. I will share it with everybody who is here, and you can share it in your networks as appropriate. And I also wanted to just do a reminder, and for those who weren't here before, at the bottom of your screen, you should have the option to click on a Q&A feature that will allow you to ask questions throughout the webinar that we will then answer at the end of a brief slide presentation. So without further ado, Drs. Galloway and Brody.
Thank you very much, and Jeanette. We're delighted to be here with you today to talk about this report that we released this morning up on Capitol Hill. The reason it is released on Capitol Hill is about 2.5 years ago, the Illinois delegation became very concerned about urban flooding in the Chicago metropolitan area and in the state of Illinois. And the Center for Neighborhood Technology in Chicago and the state of Illinois conducted studies to look at what was the threat. And they just determined that urban flooding was a distinct threat to the state of Illinois, and that a considerable amount of the flood claims that were coming in were not from the SFHA, but were from urban areas outside of the standard flood hazard area. And so this became a concern to the Congress. We, the University of Maryland and Texas A&M, volunteered to assist in looking into this problem. The committees of the Congress asked the National Academy of Science to also look at this, and there were 2 parallel studies going on for the last 2 years. Ours was released today. One will be released in January by the National Academy, looking at a separate aspect of this urban flooding issue. We are wrapping up 2 years of study of what went on in the nation in terms of urban flooding. What's the extent of it, and what are the consequences that are occurring? And the report that I believe you have access to download is our summary of that information. What we'd like to do today is give you the highlights of what our report says and then answer questions that you might have about this. We see it, as it says, as a national challenge and one that we have not addressed as well as we should, and we need to spend some time looking into this particular area in the years ahead. Next slide. The bottom line up front is this: urban flooding is a national issue, but it's also a local responsibility. It's got to be done and dealt with at the local level. The consequences of it are, in economic terms, high. The social disruption is real, and housing inequality results from the way we are doing the mitigation of this particular issue. We know the triggers, we know what causes urban flooding, and the issues are getting worse in many communities as a result of the climate change, the increased number of intense precipitation events. And there are actions that can be implemented at every level to deal with this. And there are lots of unanswered questions that you and we need to be dealing with. You've seen these slides before. This is urban flooding in Houston. Yes, rivers overflowed, but yes, intense rainfall filled the land since the rivers would not accept the flood waters coming overland. It is a problem in Houston. Next slide. It is a problem in San Jose, California, where it comes out of the rivers. This is downtown Washington, D.C., right down at on Constitution Avenue. In 2006, we had this particular flood. And this is Baltimore, Maryland recently, where a low-income housing area was badly hit by flooding. And the concerns are that this continues to occur, and that we're not dealing with these particular challenges of urban flooding, mostly outside of the special flood hazard area. This is our definition of urban flooding, and we are talking about really rainfall flooding, intense rainfall events, and that when they're matched with this increased amounts of impervious surfaces and overwhelming of the drainage systems, many of which were designed decades ago, we have a problem that is nationwide. And we'd like to share some ideas with that. We have a team here today, Sam Brody from Texas A&M, and Allison Riley, who is part of the team here at the University of Maryland, and Jayden Rainey from Texas A&M. And we're prepared to go through this with you and then answer some questions. Sam?
Thanks, Jerry. A portion of our study was to better understand what the triggers are for urban flooding. Understanding the triggers will help us address the problems. And we found nationally that it's not just the increasing episodes of intense rainfall that's in turn increasing the impact of urban flooding, but it's the built environment and the way we are spreading impervious surfaces, roadways, rooftops, highways, is literally fragmenting natural drainage patterns, creating obstacles in areas of runoff and overland flow, and creating these unintended consequences which result in water in people's homes. To kind of match the thinking on what's driving the problem, it's where is it happening? So we did a series of spatial analytics, which Jayden Rainey here today is responsible for and should get credit for. And this is just an example of one image that's in the map, in the report, and it's a map of all the federal payouts for flood loss over just a 10-year snapshot. It's what, $50 billion worth of impact, and you can see the hotspots of by county across the nation. What gets more interesting when we think about urban flooding, which is often divorced from the FEMA-defined 100-year floodplain, when we consider what is, for example, the proportion of insured claims outside of that boundary, that's a stronger indicator of the degree and the location of which urban flooding occurs. And you get an image like this, where you see that the problem is much more ubiquitous, more widespread. And at the top end, there are many counties out there where over 75% of, in this case, insured losses are outside that FEMA-defined boundary, which drives most of the regulation, the perception, the preparedness at the local level. To complement the spatial analytics, Jerry led a survey of over 100,000 people, where we had about 600 responses, and every community, every state in the United States was represented. Here are some of the highlights from that survey, so it's a companion to the report, among which 83% indicated they'd experienced urban flooding, indicating, supporting the fact that this is a ubiquitous problem. Almost half indicated it's occurred in numerous areas, so it's not just isolated once in a lifetime event. Surprisingly to us, even though we're the flood experts, 85% had experienced urban flooding outside the FEMA-defined floodplain. As we fragment and alter our drainage patterns, particularly in low-lying coastal areas, we're not just worried about moving into that FEMA-defined floodplain. It's dynamic, and it's literally moving into us. And I think the survey supports some of those observations. Next. Big picture findings to reiterate what Jerry started out with. I've been working on this issue for most of my adult life, for 20 years, and I can tell you that this urban flood problem is getting worse, to the point where I think we're at a crossroads nationally, where this issue is an issue of national importance. It's creating a lot of direct and indirect economic loss, social and educational disruption, and housing inequality. The fact that people getting hurt worse or hurt the most are those that don't have the resources and capacity to necessarily recover and mitigate. It's a widespread, wide-ranging problem. For every big acute event like Harvey, consider the fact there are hundreds of other smaller events that accumulate over time, say 5 inches of rain, not 50 inches of rain. That takes a real toll on the economic backbone of some of our local communities, particularly at the lower income levels. We found that while the problem is ubiquitous and communities across the nation are facing similar challenges, the responsibility, which is really ultimately at a local level, is not clearly defined. There is no one single national and federal agency responsible for coordinating local level activities. And to move forward as a nation to address this issue, those things need to change. We note that aging infrastructure and poor drainage maintenance is a part of this problem. And as the country moves forward thinking about how to revitalize and improve their infrastructure, stormwater management systems need to be part of that discussion. We found that one of the big issues is that governments, particularly FEMA and adjacent agencies, are not effectively communicating the risks in terms of urban flooding. Flooding that occurs, say, miles from the floodplain is something that can be measured, mapped, and better articulated to local communities and residents. We're starting a new project next month, jointly funded by FEMA, the National Academy of Sciences, and the state of Texas, to look at that issue as a pilot study in Texas, where we're going to complement the existing FEMA-defined maps with more urban flood visualizations and take that directly to the people impacted, get their feedback, and help them think about the ways they can prepare. Because if they have the information, they can better understand the degree to which their property is at risk and take necessary actions. And right now we're finding they don't have that information. And sometimes even if they do have the information, they don't have the necessary resources to mitigate and prepare and reduce the future impacts. As part of this kind of communication barrier we're finding, the data is problematic. We spent years collecting as much data as we can. It was a struggle, and I wonder how much harder it would be for a local decision maker or even a resident to get access to this data for their own purposes to better prepare, educate, and plan for the future. And so we found that the data is not easily available, it's not being shared, it's not consistent or rectified across spatial scales. And that's another area that we can focus on if we really want to protect communities in the future and start to systematically address the urban flood problem. Back to you, Jerry.
We're not here to solve the problem. We're here to make recommendations because we think there's a long way ahead. As many of you know, the National Academy of Science has a study underway. We expect, or they expect it to be finished in January, and it will deal with some of these same things in parallel with a very big focus on how is it affecting the population and what can be done to those that are hit the most with this urban flood threat. We think we need to review the current responsibilities for multi-jurisdictional planning in this arena. You can think back to Baton Rouge, you can think back to Harvey, any place where there's been a tremendous rainfall event, urban flooding. Where did the water come from and where did it go? And we're not well coordinated, multiple municipalities with responsibility, and no clear measure of who is responsible. Is it the levee improvement district? Is it a watershed district? What might be the responsibility? And that's being investigated in some states and in local areas, but it needs to be addressed. We think there needs to be a national forum that will look at what it is that we need to have as actions to move forward. It can't be done at just the federal level. It can't be done at just the local level, but we've got to find a mechanism to bring everybody together. We think one federal agency needs to provide oversight of federal support of the urban flooding business. We've got agencies that have certain responsibilities, deal with below 800 CFS floods, above 800 CFS floods. We have others that are dealing with their responsibilities under various legislation. But no one is responsible for looking at urban flood mitigation as a whole, and it fits in with other flood mitigation. So that needs to be addressed specifically. We know that the efforts have to be made to improve the way we are right now because people are at risk right now and people are suffering right now. We need to focus that mitigation where the highest risk of flooding exists economically and socially. Much of the problems we have, as Sam has already mentioned to you, are in areas where the people have less of an ability to deal with it and to come back quickly when there is some sort of a flooding. And it occurs frequently, and we need to find ways to deal with that. We also need to support local homeowners. And one that we came across is the entire issue of flooding from your sewage system. In these times of heavy rainfall events. Backflow valves work, and in Canada, they're working very hard to make that a move forward, trying to look at the issue. Could we, in fact, save money? If, in fact, the government provided the installation of backflow valves, would that in turn prevent the flooding that's going to cost even more over a period of time? And the Canadians have taken a good step forward on that. We need to integrate the urban flood risk communication that is being done in cities with that's being done by the federal government. If a municipality has some program and the federal government has one that deals with riverine and coastal flooding, those two ought to say the same thing. We ought to be dealing with the same people. There ought not to be multiple messages. We think we've got to integrate urban flood communication, mapping, and risk disclosure into the whole idea of real estate transactions. What we've heard so often as we've traveled around the country is, I didn't know. And yet, on each of these cases, there are real estate transactions where these people move into this property without a knowledge of what is really the risks they're going to face. And there are so many easy ways to do that. We have, and we point this out in the report and show examples of software that will identify what your risk is if you move in a particular area, something like a Zillow of risk. And we need to make sure that that is required to be put into real estate transactions so people are not caught cold with what happens. Congress has got to have necessary mechanisms to deal with the aging infrastructure and to upgrade. It's got to be done with the locals. It is a local responsibility, and we've got to figure out a way to make that happen. We think a risk identification grant program set up by the Congress would move a long way to alerting communities to the risks they face, because it's not getting better, as was pointed out in the conclusions. It is not getting better, it's getting worse every day, and we've got to be able to address it. And of course, we need to know more about what the threat is. As we've seen, there are many challenges out there, including the one that seems to be most difficult is, how do we get multiple communities to coordinate their activities so one does not solve its problems by putting the problem on the next community down. So there are challenges out there that we need to address. These are some of the things that we can do right now. Comprehensive planning is at the top of the list. Finding ways to store water, detention and retention ponds, eliminating or reducing the risk of flooding by having upstream activities, encourage residents to do better maintenance. The number of drains that are clogged in major metropolitan areas is amazing, but it can be taken care of if one, people report it, and two, people do something about it. We've got people that need to do better mapping. We need to have software that will identify what the challenges are. Sam Brody has the Texas A&M Buyers Beware software. Floodtools.com has a similar program. These tell you what the risks you face. And why would you go out and buy property or look for property if you didn't know what the risk you were facing? And it's there in front of you. So there are things that can be done right now. Our bottom line, our takeaway is, urban flooding is a national issue, but it's also a local responsibility. We couldn't find, as we went around the country, that locals were trying to abdicate their responsibility, but they need help on some of these, especially in multi-jurisdictional coordination, in coming up with the right solutions, doing for example, the basic mapping in the NFIP program is critical to what's going on. Locals may have their own, but this got to be coordinated. The consequences are great. They're economic, social, and there's a great deal to do with housing inequality across the nation in these flood-prone zones. We know the triggers, and they know the issues are getting worse in many communities. It's time to deal with them, and there are specific actions that can be implemented. We didn't solve all the problems. We didn't even attempt to, and we've come up with a lot of unanswered questions that we've pointed out. There are things to be done, and we would hope that you, the people that are on this call, and others will be hard at work on that.
Thank you, Dr. Galloway and Dr. Brody. That concludes the presentation portion of the webinar. For those who have joined later, there is an option at the bottom of your screen. If you click on Q&A, you'll be able to ask some questions, which we will turn to now. This webinar is being recorded, and so for the benefit of the recording, I will read these questions out loud in the order we've received them and let Drs. Galloway and Brody answer. The first is, What is urban flooding? Inundation of a building alone, or does it include loss of a travel lane in a road, other infrastructure impacts?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, urban flooding is flooding that is exacerbated or created by features of the built environment. So it doesn't have to be downtown New York City, concrete jungle. It can be a suburban or even exurban developed area. Absolutely, flooding to me, and in this study, is not just water in a building. It can be water in a garage. It could be loss of travel time. It could be for my kids who have frequent flood days, not snow days, but flood days from their school, because the roads flood so frequently. They close the schools, which is problematic if you have two people working full time. That's a turns out to be a major economic and educational disruption. And so we need to dig deeper. Our study was kind of the first step, but there are a lot of indirect impacts that need to be quantified, that can be quantified and baked into understanding the what, where, and why of this urban flood problem.
And the report does define what urban flooding is, the term we're using, and it's basically resting on FEMA's definition of urban flooding. But urban, and we've talked to a lot of people who say, "Oh, urban." I don't live in New York City or Baltimore or Washington where we have that problem. It occurs in Ottumwa, Iowa. It occurs in Ankeny, San Jose. It occurs in communities all around the country, and it can be everything that prevents you from getting to work. If you're an hourly worker and your streets flood 2 or 3 times a month, or more often now as we're combining rainfall flooding with sea level rise, you would begin to have some serious problems economically in these communities. Or if you live in low income communities, whether it's in suburban areas or in smaller towns, and you can't respond, you don't have the resources to respond when it happens.
Our next question, as a follow-up from the survey, did the question define urban flooding, or was this left to the imagination of the person responding?
Well, we did have it. You'll see it in the definition is in the front of the report. And
I think they're asking, were the survey respondents given the definition?
Yeah, the survey respondents were given the definition.
Is it possible that FEMA will begin to adopt and regulate urban floodplains?
I think that's not going to happen in the near future, but I think there should be national and local efforts to complement the existing FEMA regulatory floodplains with some kind of delineation or visualization of risk and impact outside those areas. And I think that is going to happen in the near future simply by FEMA being a major funding partner in our urban flood mapping project about to start. I think shows their interest and commitment in trying to better get at this issue in less traditional ways.
And as we've, I think, noted that the National Academy of Science is doing a parallel study on urban flooding that will, again, emphasize many of these same points and the challenges of coordinating all the activity in the urban floodplain and finding ways to deal with that.
Have streams or drainage ways that have been placed in sewers in urban areas been mapped?
Sometimes, but not all the time.
Yeah, the challenge is we've got 19,000 incorporated areas in this country, something like that. And each one of them has a different set of circumstances. Urban flooding is not just New York City, and it's not just small towns in Nebraska or Iowa. It's all kinds of towns as we go from the large to the small. And in the report, we have responses from people from small towns and large towns, and it would be interesting in our volume 2 to look at some of those responses and see what they're saying.
And for your information, that volume 2 is available on at the cdr.umd website link that you received as part of the invitation to this webinar. Could you define urban flooding associated with density so as not to alleviate small towns?
We got at that in the report when we were classifying what urban is or isn't. In the beginning, we were taking the census definition of urban, which at the time it wasn't MSAs, they changed it to CBSA.
CBSA.
So that was grounded in density, right?
Yes.
So we got at that. It's a tricky issue because we don't want to, we need to use urban flooding because that's the lexicon that FEMA is promoting, and that's kind of the term being used. But we need to back that up with explanation that we're not just talking about the highly urbanized, totally built out areas. And because they're in suburban and exurban developed areas, there are more opportunities to think about green infrastructure, open space protection. We don't want to ignore those issues. The other question I see up here, I don't think what we're proposing to generate a whole new set of regulatory maps, certainly not at the outset, but I think we can identify risk and impact zones more quickly without the burden of H&H models in a way that isn't meant necessarily to regulate, but to inform and help residents prepare when they're not in one of these regulatory zones, if that makes sense. Sure, you want to
We've given in the report a link to something that the Swiss have just put out, and they're identifying areas that are subject to heavy rainfall events. They don't try and do it to the inch. They're trying to identify where it happens so that a combination of insurers and local officials and residents can figure out that they're in a risk zone and they ought to learn more about what's going on. We also show in the report a number of options for mapping, including one that's being used now in Fort Worth, where they're looking at what floods in the city that's not in the SFHA is way away from the other places. We see this in many places around the country. Do you need to have a regulatory map there? No, you need to have knowledge sent to the people that they're at risk. Most people say, I didn't know my area was going to flood. Now, in other areas, they know it's going to flood all the time. And do you want to pre-warn them by having that mapped in some fashion? But does it need to map at the FEMA NFIP level? The surveys we sent out and the comments we got back said, let's not make this a big deal. Let the communities decide what's best for them, whether it's a 2,000, 10,000 person community in Iowa, or it's a 500,000 person community somewhere else.
Does the urban flooding economic damage map shown in the presentation include all urban flooding damage? Does it include households that do not have flood insurance?
I'm going to give Jayton Rainey the opportunity to address that because that's right in your wheelhouse. And I feel like it's time for you to chime in on the data end.
Yes, and please correct me if there's anything that I say is wrong here. So as far as the maps that I produced, it was taken mainly from the NFIP damage that is in open source data from FEMA, as well as FEMA individual assistance and FEMA public assistance. And so all of those are recording all flood damage. Now that's that first map where you can really highlight those low-lying coastal and high-density areas. And so that second map is taking those parcel-level data that we have access to and figuring out which floodplain they are in, and then that is how we determined that urban floodplain that falls outside of the X zone, or that falls within the X floodplain.
So we're using insured losses, but also we're able to get individual assistance data and other type of losses at a national scale. As we move into our pilot study, which will be around specific local communities in Texas, we're going to take the next step forward up at a notch, and we're going to start using structural assessments of flood damage, also crowdsourcing data, survey data to add to that, because that question is a good question, that just looking at insured losses, which frankly I've been doing for 10 years, this is a huge part of the problem, and it's mostly a data problem. It's not that we just want to look at insured losses, but until recently, other types of data haven't been available. With social media and crowdsourcing data, I think it's a great opportunity to start really filling in the gaps.
What recommendations do you have for FEMA to address urban flooding?
Well, the purpose of the study, as we started with, was not to solve the problem, because there's a lot of people on this call and otherwise who've got good solutions to this. We were to find out, was it more extensive than the flooding that we had reported in Illinois? Was it national? And what are the consequences? Well, we're pointing out that it's extensive and it's national, and it is also one that has many consequences that we have not thought of being addressed, and there are many challenges to be addressed. And we'll leave that to the next step. The forthcoming National Academy study that will come out in January will add more information to this, but I think it's going to take a while to decide exactly what FEMA can and can't do. And the concern that we had for many communities is, let's not get into new programs. Let's figure out what it is that we need to do and then see whether it's best addressed. As we said earlier, they believe in most communities it's best addressed at the local level. And how can the federal government support that activity?
It sounds like more of a comment. We also need to be aware of CSO issues in urban areas when heavy rains occur.
That is addressed in the report. We're looking at CSO being a real challenge.
Did your work identify any existing outreach materials to educate local elected officials with respect to flood risk, potential damage, and cost funding for mitigation?
There's been several reports that have been written. Ours did not focus on that. That's a fertile field for people to deal with. And we know NAFSMA, ASFPM, and others are trying to get the right information out to the people and to educate them. What we're saying is, you better know, and one of our recommendations in there was we would think the Congress ought to support a risk identification program so that local communities will know what their challenges are and be able to deal with them. The worrisome part that we saw is, in many cases, when these are occurring in low-income areas, areas that don't have high economic losses, but have high social losses, they don't get the attention they deserve. So there's a lot that needs to be done. We're identifying the problems, and with the people that are on this call, we know that you have, we've talked to many of you, that there are things you can do, and we know that should be done, that you can work on.
How can we encourage data sharing?
I think we at FEMA can leverage the data that they already collect, and I know they're working on this. They're great people there moving forward with this, where they're able to share data that doesn't compromise personal information in a way that researchers, decision makers, residents can really start to make sense of what's happening and where and the extent of it. To file a FOIA to get NFIP claims, I think those days hopefully are dwindling, where instead serving some of this information over cloud-based servers that's aggregated to a level that's appropriate. I don't think there's any reason we can't do that. The spatial analytic techniques and tools in place give us so much leverage to address this problem in more meaningful ways. Really, one of the things that's holding us back is the ability to share data. And I see people like Liz Ash and FEMA and others really taking that to heart and setting up, it may take a while, but setting up agreements and systems where we'll be able to see this data, not just filing a FOIA or waiting 6 months with a legal contract, but being able to download data at smaller and smaller scales. So that's my hope, and it's one of my bandwagons because I think it's a big obstacle for moving forward, that there's so much data out there, it's just not available and easily accessible. If we can free some of those log jams, I think we can take bigger steps towards not just understanding the problem, but addressing it.
FEMA is licensing flood maps from CatRisk and AIR. Both of those have an urban flood component. Have you looked at those?
Not specifically CatRisk in AIR in the report. We've looked at floodtools.com, we've gone to the SWIFT, we've gone to NASA. There are numerous things out there. The challenge is getting something that's easily accessible and understandable. When we looked at buyers beware, which is something that Sam Brody came up with as an approach to getting the information out, we found that many people were very interested in dealing with that. The question is, how do you get it out? How do you share it? What's useful? And what's going to be low cost to the people that are involved? So there's a lot of room there in dealing with this whole business of risk communication that requires us to think about who's going to do it. And underlying all of this seems to be the necessity to continue to have national information available that can be the basis for some of this.
Oh, wait, Lisa here. She had a...
Yeah, we skipped Lisa.
Oh, I apologize.
So Lisa, as part of my work, my other hat is working for the Texas Commission for Rebuild Texas after Harvey, and that report's coming out next week for the state. Yes, we collect all these great examples, and I had one of the researchers put together a table of examples of different mitigation techniques that are taking place around the country. I initially also did it for Chad Berganis at ASFPM. It's not in the report, but if you email me or anyone on this call, I'm happy to share that. I kind of did that as, to help educate Texans that some of this stuff we're proposing in our shop is not brand new, it's happening. And it kind of led to this large spreadsheet put together by a graduate student. And so that rings true to my heart. So I'm happy to share that if you just email me.
We have about 5 minutes left, so we'll try to move through as many of the remaining 10 questions as we can. If we're not able to answer your question, we'd be happy to follow up with you afterwards to address any questions. A risk assessment implies a known or estimated frequency of occurrence. How do you address an expected frequency with urban flooding as you define it?
That's a wonderful question. And in days of non-stationarity and the problems that we're finding, the Swiss answered that by saying, we don't need to know at the inch level. We need to know, are you in a risk area to flooding? Because we can't tell you what it's going to be 5 years from now. And even when we had the ability to do better, we didn't have the resources to complete the actions necessary to do that. So I think we have a research question, or a question we all need to answer, is how much information do we really need in an urban environment, not the riverine environment, in an urban environment to estimate what is the challenge you face in this area. If you have enough rain, that 3 inches of rain is going to flood every basement on a street, and a lot of people live in those basements, that's a big issue. It might not mean the same thing in people whose basements are not used for living accommodations or other things like that. This is a really good question and an open one.
Is urban flooding really a problem? We can exploit open lower areas in urban areas to store water. This could be true for streets also. Many communities have dedicated streets to address excess flows. With climate change impacts, we may not be able to eliminate flooding in urban areas. We can address urban damage. Also, urban flooding can help in storing water, another byproduct of flooding, urban or not.
Another good question. The urban flood problem, particularly at a regional level, is about finding areas where we want to put structures and infrastructure, finding areas where we want it to flood, right? We want to accommodate the flood water. I think the idea of storage, both through natural systems and, say, cisterns and underground or regional detention, is part of the equation of what we're talking about. In Houston, where I live, a lot of the streets are designed to flood, and the engineers know that. They don't consider that flooding. But if you're parked on the street or you're caught in a street flood, that's flooding, that's impact. So it's not being communicated to residents that streets will flood. And during Harvey, I knew my street would flood. I knew my house, well, actually my house was okay. But I went up and down the street telling people to move their cars, and I thought it was crazy. And the picture in that report of the flooded car is right outside the window from my house. So the one person I didn't get to, now people still think I'm crazy. I'm not invited over for neighborhood dinners anymore. But I think that the communication barrier, whether the streets flood or not, needs to be addressed. And if people know the streets are going to flood, they can move their cars, which is usually their second biggest asset. For me, it might be my first biggest asset at this point. And in places like Houston, if you don't have a car, you're not getting to work very easily.
And the other thing that's very important in that is that as you look at what happens, how do people who are on hourly wage jobs get to work? And if the streets aren't open, they can't get in. They can't get their pay. The children can't get to school. The ramifications are very large, and we've got to figure out some way of dealing with that. And that's part of the inequity in how at least many people perceive the way we're treating flooding in urban areas today.
Your recommendations are very good, but how do we encourage our current Congress and administration, and they've added who is a self-professed expert in all areas, that refuses to believe in global warming and the resulting increased severity in storms to undertake these initiatives?
We just came from briefing 45 congressional staffers on the Hill, and I didn't see any of that there, this reluctance. They were there because their constituents are concerned about how you deal with this. And there are several bits of legislation that are being thought of right now to deal with some flood issues that in the new House, we had people from both the Senate and the House, but in the new House are certainly going to get a lot of attention.
What are your thoughts on how industry can target increased flood insurance purchase in urban flooding areas?
So by industry, I'm assuming that's the insurance industry. I think it's partnering with local communities. So the high-end CRS communities are all about advertising the importance of flood insurance. Houston, post-Harvey, literally took out billboards. There are all kinds of messaging, both from public and private sectors. And as a result, I'm told from FEMA, there's a huge spike in insurance policies. When they called me up, they're like, what's going on? Did you just buy 10,000 policies? It's like, I didn't buy them, but I think that's a result of increased awareness and increased messaging. And as federal insurance becomes more privatized, there's going to be, I think, a bigger role for the private industry to get that message out.
And I believe this will have to be our last question. Understanding urban flooding is occurring in many different types of communities. Did the study find urban flooding more frequent in combined systems or MS4s? And were the age of or lack of infrastructure found across both types of systems?
We didn't address, we didn't do any statistical analysis of this. This is written as a study of a broad number of issues that come up in urban flooding, and to give people the answer to the question, is it a problem and where is the problem? However, there are a number of, in volume 2, there are a number of responses from people in these communities that move towards this, and it's worth your while to look through volume 2 and the comments that were made. They're all anonymous, and we've guarded the data, but people recognize that there are many issues, and it's tough to be at the local area because there are so many challenges about the different people that are dealing with these problems.
Well, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, and I apologize to those whose questions we weren't able to get to, but I will be following up this webinar with an email link to the recording, and in that I will include some contact information if you would like to discuss some of these issues further. Any final thoughts, Dr. Brody or Dr. Galloway?
No,
thank you for being here.
I really appreciate it, and we really welcome your feedback.
Thank you, and good afternoon.